Okay, let's get started. So, this is the first of Reason Prep's live streams for primarily SAT and ACT prep, but we'll also do things with subject tests and college admissions and whatever. We'll see where this goes. I did these live streams, I think last year sometime. It was 2 years ago. I don't remember. Did them for a while, stopped doing them. I do want to start them up again because I think people really like them. So, a few starting places or a few guiding rules. Let me just get my screen going on here. Okay. So a few little notes in terms of sending questions. So if you want to ask a question about the SAT, the ACT, whether it's a general question, whether it's a specific question. So if you have a question from a practice test that you're doing or a book or whatever it might be, you can send me questions. So to do that, send an email to ask@reasonprep.com. You can see on the screen over there, you can see the email address. And for simplicity, if you're asking a question about some problem, like an SAT problem or an ACT problem, please include the answer because if I have to wonder if I did it right and I have to go look up the answer, it's just terrible. So just give me the answer just so I know when I do it if I've done it right or wrong, and we don't have to worry about that. If there's an image for the problem, like if it's something you can just take a picture of or take a screenshot of and send it to me, that would really help. And the source of the question, if possible. So if it's from the Barron's book or it's from SAT test number 5, whatever it is, anything like that would be great just to let me know what the source of it is. Sometimes that helps. And then you can also ask general questions. So questions about the SAT in general, the ACT in general, whatever. The number of the questions I got today were more general. But if you can, please be as specific as you can. So if you ask a question like, I scored a 1,000. What can I do to get a 1,400? That's an impossible question for me to answer in a live stream. It's way too broad. My whole books are written about that. But instead, if you can focus to that and say, all right, how do I do better in vocab and context questions on the reading? This happens to me and this happens to me. What can I do to improve? I can work with that a little bit better. So try to keep your questions narrow if you can. This broadcast, after we're done, I'm going to edit it down and post it on YouTube. So if you ever miss a broadcast, you ever miss a live stream, you'll be able to see the video on YouTube. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So again, feel free to send questions anytime. I'm still learning the tech. This is the first time I've done this with all my new gadgets, so you're going to have to be patient with me as I figure out what the heck I am doing. I can actually probably do that. Okay, so let's go through some questions here. So these were all sent to me from students, and I'm just going to probably copy and paste these. And that's a little annoying. Let's see. All right, that's not going to work. Let's do this. I'd prefer, not that it really matters, but if you could send one question per email, that would be great. It's not the end of the world, but just eventually, if we get a lot of people coming into these and I get emails with like 4 questions per email, it's going to be impossible for me to keep up with everything. Okay, so some questions here more about general SAT stuff. First one, how strict and competitive are Ivy Leagues from a U.S. perspective, as I'm an international student? And what are your main points of guidance to getting into an Ivy League purely in an SAT score aspect? So Ivy Leagues are insanely competitive, as I'm sure many of you know. In terms of what you can do to get in for an SAT perspective, unfortunately, I don't have a very cool answer. It's just get a high score. But I will say this, to not be glib. The thing with SAT scores, regardless of where you're looking, whether it's top tier Ivy or wherever, they matter, but they don't define you exactly, because you've got SAT scores or ACT scores, you've got GPA, you've got extracurriculars, you've got your college admissions essay, all that kind of stuff. That all goes into a package. So if you don't have quite the scores that a typical admitted student would have to get into a Cornell or a Harvard or whatever, it doesn't mean you're doomed, because other parts of your application, your grades, your extracurriculars, and so on, may help support you, may create a picture that the admissions board or admissions committees are going to like. Same thing if you have really high scores. So if you do awesome on the SAT, you get a 1,600. That's no guarantee to get into any of these schools, especially Ivies. They're insanely competitive. They have their really pick of the litter. And even if you've got like the best scores ever, it doesn't guarantee anything. So it's kind of good news and bad news thing. The good news is if you don't have great scores, you still have a fighting shot. The one thing I would say is don't just apply to Ivies. Of course, always apply to a mix of schools. You don't want to throw in your lot into one type of school. You want to get a good mix of Ivies and standard schools and reach schools and all that stuff. Okay, I'm gonna try to monitor the chat occasionally, but again, I'm getting better at this. We'll see how well I do this. Okay, so I will get to these in a second. Let's finish these and I'll come to some chat questions. So, how weighted is the SAT essay in contributing to the overall score? Is there a particular style? So I go through a lot of this detail about the essay in my SAT essay course. It's free on my site, reasonprep.com. I recommend you check that out. Just to answer this question briefly, the SAT score for the essay is not folded into the 1600 score. So the SAT is out of 1600, and then the score you get on the essay is from 2 to 8 times 3 for each of the 3 categories, and they don't mix at all. And in fact, a lot of colleges don't even look at the essay, so I wouldn't worry a ton about it in most cases. So really the focus should be on the multiple choice, but they don't interact at all, the 2 scores. In terms of a particular style, I go into this more in the essay course, but formal. It's supposed to be a formal essay, so the kinds of essays you'd write for your English class would be appropriate. In terms of tackling reading questions, I don't know what you mean by rhetorical. That's more of a grammar, writing, language type thing. For inference type, I will say one thing. I go over this a lot in my videos and courses, but I will say the most important thing I think you should know for inference questions on reading, and that is don't overthink them. This is probably one of the most common questions I get for reading. It's like, oh, these inference questions are really annoying. What do I do? Most of the time, they're really just like any other question in the sense that the answer is in the text, even if it's an inference question. The answer is in the text. You just have to find the portion of the passage that gives you the answer. It gives you the clue. And whenever you have to do an inference, it's not going to be much beyond what's there. So don't overthink them too much would be the most important thing I would say. Okay, let me just... hello to all. Okay, so let's actually get to some chat questions here. I'm going to try to answer the easy ones first. Is there going to be a recording? Yes, there will be a recording of this on the channel. So if you miss it, you can check it out later. Okay, so I'll get to some of those broader questions soon. Let me get to some other questions that were sent to me. All right. Okay, so here's a question about math shortcuts. Again, a little broad because there's potentially a lot of shortcuts. It just depends on the questions that you're looking at. And so I'm trying to think what would be a good... The most important shortcut, I would say, is make sure you know not only your formulas, your formulas are up front. So like area formulas, those aren't super important because there's not much geometry on the test. But I would say know the formulas that are not up front. So for example, slope formula, you should know that off the top of your head. You should know how to use sine, cosine, tangent for the harder SAT math problems. So you want to know the facts, the concepts, the formulas. You want to know those down cold. That's probably the biggest shortcut because the more time you're sitting there trying to think, oh, what's the slope formula, or what's the slope-intercept formula, or whatever it might be. What's the formula for the equation of a circle would be another one. The more time you're sitting there thinking, what's this, what's that, the less time you have to work on problems. That'd be the most important shortcut, I would say. There's, it depends on the problem. So when we go through problems, you'll see me work through shortcuts. That's honestly the best way to take a look at this, is to see actual problems and how you work through them. A follow-up question about essays. In terms of, so what you have to do is look up particular school policies. Every college has their own policy in terms of what they think about the essay. I believe the College Board, I'm not going to look it up now. If someone in chat wants to look it up, there's a link on the College Board where they'll show you like what school policies are. So the question there was specifically about UCs. I don't know off the top of my head. So either schools are going to require them, recommend them, or neither require nor recommend. And even the ones that do require it, this is what I was hinting at before, even the ones that require it, because the SAT essay is still so new, they don't really know what to do with it yet. So I'm not really convinced that it, unless you get twos, I'm not really convinced that it makes that much of a difference. Unless you get something really, really poor like twos or threes. If you can get minimum fives on each of them, and preferably 6+, that's going to be good even for, I think, the most elite schools of those that do even accept them. And many don't even worry about the essay. So I don't worry too much about the essay compared to when it used to be required, but even still. All right, let's get to another question. So another question about essay. Everyone loves the essay, or maybe loves to hate it. I'm going to find a better way to display questions because this is kind of annoying. Okay, so I recently got back my SAT scores, and the analysis part on the essay wasn't so good. Essay was good, but analysis was lacking. So I go over this a lot in the SAT essay course. The analysis, there are 3 scores you're going to get for your essay. You've got your reading, your analysis, and your writing. And typically reading and writing are not going to be too bad. So this is from 2 to 8, 2 to 8, 2 to 8. Typically, especially with some training, most students don't have much problems with the reading and the writing. The analysis is always the tricky part, and I talk about this a lot in the course. So for more details, check out the free SAT essay course on my site. The analysis is the hard part. So there's a few components to this. One is you need to know the basic rhetorical strategies that authors use. And I have a list of this in the course. You can get a whole list of them. So you want to know things like how authors use evidence, statistics, how they use arguments by analogy, how they use arguments by induction or deduction. You want to know use of vivid language, tone, argument, appeal to authority, appeal to emotion, hyperbole, exaggeration, understatement, like irony, sarcasm, all these kinds of strategies. You want to know what these are, so that when you're reading the essay, you know, okay, here's an example of this, here's an example of this, here's an example of this, because you want to be specific. That's the most important thing I can say about analysis. Be specific about the type of strategy that you're talking about. If you're too broad, that's often what people run into. A lot of times students will they'll talk about like logos, ethos, and pathos, which, is all right, but logos literally means logic. So saying that something is logical isn't really very interesting. It's a little too broad. Saying something is driven with emotion is interesting, but be more specific. So the main thing with analysis is specificity. Be specific, really drill into it. You don't have to cover everything. Just find the 3 items that you want to talk about and focus in on those. Okay, let's see. Let me try to catch up on chat a little bit. First question, ACE questions on evidence. I guess you mean in reading, like the command of evidence questions. We'd really have to see specific examples of that to see how that would go. Again, it gets back to what I was saying with the inference questions. The answer's in the text. And I'm going to just consistently say this again and again, because a lot of students get hung up on reading something and then kind of imagining what maybe it could be saying or might be saying, or maybe the author means this, or really maybe the author is actually saying this in a kind of secretive way. That kind of activity is not good. It's got to be, you have to have what I call passage discipline. Stick to the text. The answer is there. If you don't know what the answer is, you probably just haven't found it. It's an issue of finding the text. And that's the most important thing. Main math patterns on the SAT. Again, pretty broad. How would I answer that usefully? I don't know how to answer that in a useful way. Again, when we get to specific questions, the best way to do this is when I get through some specific questions that were sent to me, I can identify to you how I think of this in terms of patterns, how I think of this in terms of the types of questions you'll see. I think that'll be the most useful way to answer this. How to understand what you read for non-native students. Unfortunately, there's no magic bullet with reading. It comes down to just reading a lot. especially if you're non-native, if you're non-native speaker. Like if you're non-native speaker in whatever language you speak, if I walked up to you and said, I would love to speak and read in your language, do you have any tips? You kind of know that's kind of an impossible question to answer, right? There's not one or two or three tips that will suddenly make me fluent in your language or in any language. Same thing with English. Even native speakers, there's not one or two or three tips that's going to make you a fluent reader. What it comes down to is time. It comes down to practice. It comes down to, especially on the SAT, practicing questions and really taking the time to understand how the passages are written, how they're constructed. Unfortunately, the problem with the reading is there's no magic bullet when it comes to those. Taking state ACT on the 19th, are there any last minute tips? Let's see, that's in pretty soon. It's in 5 days. Without knowing what you've done so far, your background, anything like that, the main thing, again, the most important thing would be don't, this is kind of a cop-out answer, but I made a video about this, and it's one of the most disliked videos I have on YouTube. Oh well. But its truth is the best thing you can do, like the day before, is do nothing, is to relax. Because a lot of people cram the day before, they stay up late studying the day before, they don't get enough sleep, and that does much more damage than you would ever hope to do good by studying and cramming. So really the day before, you should be relaxing, chilling, letting whatever you've prepped before settle in so that you're ready and you're fresh to go the day of the test. Before that, again, it depends on your situation, so I can't give much more specific advice than that. Owen is in the Bahamas on vacation, but watching this now. Wow. That's dedication to the SAT and to the ACT. Welcome. Okay, let's get to some emailed questions here. Okay, we did this one. Okay, we got a specific problem here. So when it comes to specific problems, to avoid copyright issues, I'm not going to probably most of the time put the question in the video because I don't know the sources of these things. And like I said, I just want to be careful with copyright. Not that probably anyone would care, but just to be safe. Sometimes I might, if it's like a reading passage, I might have to, but I'm going to try my best to avoid this. So we've got b squared minus 36 equals a times b. In the equation above, if a is greater than 0 and a and b are integers, what is one possible value of a? Okay, so this person, okay, they gave me more than one answer. Okay, so the previous question was about patterns. Someone had a question about math patterns. And when we're talking about math patterns, the main thing I would say on this one is to recognize like what family of problems this is from. So when I see this, the first thing that pops into my head is quadratics, of course. We've got b squared minus 36, which actually looks like the difference of two perfect squares. I don't know if that will be relevant, maybe, but it's interesting. And so I know I'm in that family. So when I think about quadratics, I think, what do I do with quadratics? Well, I do things like factor them. I solve for solutions. I do the quadratic equation. I do the discriminant. There's all different kinds of things I might do. And what I would do at this point, if I don't know exactly what to do, is just kind of mess around and see what happens. So b squared minus, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the ab over here just to make it like a quadratic. So the key in this one is to realize, okay, I'm going to need two numbers that are, if I were to factor this, I'm going to need two numbers that are going to multiply out to negative 36. And when that happens, I'm going to be, by definition, defining what my a value is. For example, one of the solutions, one of the products you can get here would be negative 9 and 4. So minus 9 and positive 4. And think about what that means if it multiplies out to negative 36. That means they're going to add up to negative 9 plus 4. That adds up to negative 5. Right? That would be the sum. And that sum is going to be this a value. Because when you factor these out, this would be b minus 9, b plus 4. That multiplies out to negative 36. And then when you add up negative 9b and plus 4b, you're going to get negative 5b. Now the trick here is, since we already have minus ab, that means A is going to have to be 5 so that this would actually work out to be -5. So the point is we're going to get -5, or we're going to get 5 as one of our answers. And if you think about all the possibilities for your solutions, you could have 9 and -4, which would also be 5. You could have other ones. You could have 12 and 3, which would get you 9. You could have 18 and 2, which gets you 16, or 36 and 1, which gets you 35. The point is you're going to get 4 different possible answers here, depending on what your product originally was. So what numbers you multiplied to get to -36. So that's how you get those 4 answers. So again, that's the way we think about this. The category is quadratics. Just start factoring, see what happens. A lot of times you don't know where you're going to go until you actually get there. So you have to just kind of mess around and see what you get. Okay, next question. Okay, common question here. This is about SAT as well. Maybe I'll just make this smaller and then I'll... Okay. So in the reading section, there's 13 minutes per passage, right? 5 passages, 65 minutes, 65 divided by 5 gets you 13. So should I skip every question after the 13 minutes because I take a lot of time in one passage, more than 13, which affects my time at the end, especially in the last passage? So there's a few things going on here. Let me enumerate them. The first thing would be passage order. I talk about this in my reading course, among other things. And just because the passages are in a certain order in the test doesn't mean you have to do them in that order. So, for example, the history passage, the one from the 1800s typically, if that one takes up a lot of your time, if that's going to be one of the ones that typically gets you above that 13-minute limit, doing it first or doing it before you finish everything else is kind of a bad idea. So that might be a passage you leave until the end. So the idea here is you're going to do hard passages last and do the easier ones first. So this depends on you. So the history might be hard for you. For me, fiction passages would be, I guess, my worst one. So I would tend to do that one last. and yeah, so you want to do the hard passages last so that if you run into this issue, at least you finished everything else. You don't have to worry about running out of time on easier questions. The other thing, what I would add to this, the other thing I would add to this as well is don't get hung up on questions. So the problem with what's being suggested here is that once we run on over 13 minutes, whatever questions we have left, we're going to have to guess on because we didn't have time on and move on to the next passage just to keep that bracketing. The problem with that is if we got hung up on a really hard question earlier in that set and that forces us to skip easy questions later, that sucks, right? Because now we're spending time on a hard question, we might still get it wrong, and then we have easy questions that we have to skip and guess on, and that stinks. So what do we have to do instead? What we have to do instead is keep moving. Don't get hung up. So part of this is knowing which questions for you are harder than others. Part of this is just knowing not to get sucked into one question. Part of this is knowing proper question order so you don't get hung up on questions. But what you should be doing if you're going to skip questions is skipping the hard ones, not the easy ones. So you want to constantly be moving around so that you get to those easy questions first and then skip the hard ones. And then if you have time, come back later. More that can be said on this, but I think that's enough for now. Okay, another question. Many people say that SAT 2 is easy. Is that true? I'm taking math level 1 in biology. So it depends. Maybe, maybe not. It depends on your background. It depends on your abilities. It depends on the test. So for example, math level 1 would probably be easier than physics. But does that really mean much? Not really. So in the end, whether it's easy or not, I highly recommend you take at least a practice test of each before you even sit for the real thing. You want to know what to expect. And that will tell you how easy or not easy it is. So for example, take chemistry. I know the chemistry test really well. So if you've done AP chemistry or honors chemistry, the test will probably be okay for you. Probably won't be too bad. You may have to learn a few little gimmicks here and there, but it's not terrible. If you've only done like regular chemistry, though, you're probably going to struggle more with the test, the subject test. So it depends on your background, it depends on other factors. I wouldn't say that they're easy overall. I think they're challenging enough, but they're definitely manageable. That's for sure. Okay. Let me catch up on some chat questions here. How do I manage time on the reading section for both tests? So pretty broad question, hard for me to answer that in a concise way. Let me give you, again, a general tip for SAT and ACT in general in terms of time management. And I talk about this a lot in my videos, so some of you out there may have heard me say this before. So when it comes to SAT and ACT reading, but this actually applies really to any section. It applies to anything. It applies to ACT science. It applies to the math sections of both tests. Here's the thing. Don't get hung up, unless you're going for like a 36 or 1600. Don't get hung up on finishing the section. I think this is the big issue that a lot of students have. So let's take ACT reading. The biggest question I get is, how do I finish the section? How do I finish the test? I'm running out of time. And that's actually like not really the right question. The right question is, how do I get more questions right? That's what matters. Whether you finish the section or not, certainly it correlates to some extent to how many you're getting right. But what matters is getting more right, not finishing the section. Finishing the section is a nice bonus, and certainly if you're going for a perfect score, you're going to need to finish. But if you're going on the ACT, let's say you're targeting a 30 in reading, finishing the section is not strictly required. Same thing if you're going for a 700 reading. Finishing the section is not required. What's required is getting the questions right you need to get right to get the score you want to get. So in terms of time management, I got a lot that I can say about this, and probably will come up over different questions, and certainly it's in my videos elsewhere. The thing to think about is, how do I get more questions right? And that changes the game, because now instead of how do I finish the test, it's how do I make sure I squeeze every point out of every easy question that I can, and every medium question that I can. How do I triage? How do I segregate my hard questions so that I don't waste time on a hard question when I've got easy and medium questions to go? So think instead, not finishing the section is not the big issue in many cases that people think it is. Getting questions wrong that you should have gotten right is the problem. So that's what I want you to think about in terms of time management. Again, I've got a lot more to say about it, but that's just the most concise answer I can give temporarily. So Pizza Hunter, I love pizza, good name, has a question. I have trouble with transition word questions in the writing section. This would also apply, by the way, to the ACT English. So transition word. And transition word questions in the writing section and get them wrong. Any idea how to fix this? So transition word questions. This is those questions where you have to pick from like however, moreover, for example, that kind of thing. And I talk about this in the writing course. I have a video on what are called the 4 principles, where I talk about the 4 elements that you need to pay attention to for these kinds of questions and rhetorical skills questions generally. For these questions, what I would point you to is principle number 2. Principle number 2 is you want to make sure your choice produces logical flow. So one of the problems that students often have on these questions is they just focus on the sentence with the however or the therefore or the moreover or whatever in it. You got to focus on the whole. You got to focus on the sentences before and after, because that shows you the flow of ideas through that paragraph. So if you're just focused on a small portion of that paragraph, you're going to be missing that flow. And what you're paying attention to is what makes logical sense to connect one sentence to the next. So for example, a very simple example would be, if there's contrast of ideas, you're going to need a contrasting word like however, nevertheless, on the other hand, etc. If there is cause and effect, so if one thing is the effect of something else, then you would need something like a thus or a in conclusion or therefore, something like that. So it's about the flow logically from one part of the paragraph to the next. So I recommend checking out that video in my writing course. It's for free. You can find it on YouTube. Just Google or YouTube 4 Principles Reason Prep. It should come up and you'll see all about this. Okay. All right, let's get to some more emailed questions. Again, if you're just joining us, you can send questions to ask@reasonprep.com. That's probably the best way to get them to me, especially if you're going to send me an actual like problem that I can look at. Or you can leave them in chat. I'm trying to manage both, but hopefully I don't miss anything. Okay. So I have a question about getting the main idea when you're reading. This is also a very common question. And getting the main idea, this applies to both SAT and ACT reading. First things first, most questions on both tests don't require you to know the main idea. So just like with inference questions, main idea isn't really as important as some might think. Certainly there are questions that are going to be more general, absolutely. And even some specific questions might have some general idea you need to know to answer them. But most questions on both tests are specific and don't require us to know the main idea. So that's the first thing. It's not going to be the be-all, end-all. However, when we want to find the main idea, and certainly that's something to do, especially to answer certain questions, it depends on the passage. We could work through an actual passage and we can see, okay, how does this lead to a main idea? How do we get the main idea out of what we've read? So it really depends on the actual passage. But I would say the one thing, a few things I can mention, would be pay attention to really the first 2 paragraphs especially. At the very least are going to set up the main idea. So sometimes they will, for example, set up what people used to think about a topic so that the new, so that this article will then say something different about it. Or maybe they'll just lay out the argument right away. So those first 2 paragraphs, maybe even first 3, but I think first 2 is good enough, are really very important. Then topic sentences of the other paragraphs can sometimes help, especially when they reveal kind of transitional language, transition sentence, because they can give you the structure of what the argument might be. And then probably the most important thing for finding the main idea is pay attention to moments of contrast and difference. So what do we mean by that? So when you're reading a passage and the author says something like, previous scientists believed X, that's a really important moment because what the author's probably going to do is contrast his or her argument to that, to what people used to believe or to what other people believe. So you're looking for moments where the author is drawing contrasts between his or her ideas and other people's ideas. Because in that contrast, you're going to see what the author is trying to say. Because arguments, main ideas don't really make sense without knowing what part of the conversation they are in. So like think of any piece of writing as being part of a conversation, a broader conversation with all other kinds of scientists and writers. And getting the main idea only makes sense when you understand where in the conversation it sits. And you do this by paying attention to contrast and to difference. Where do you see, like we saw before with the transition words and writing questions, where do you see words like however, on the other hand, nevertheless, things like that, wherever the author mentions other people's ideas. All the stuff can tell you what the ideas are that that author's reacting to, and that therefore defines his or her ideas accordingly. Okay, so we have a question about ACT. So I made a 34 in English, but only 22 reading. How to improve the reading by 3 to 4 points. So there's a lot of things you could do. Probably the quickest thing you could do, given where you are in the score range and what you want for the reading, is just do 3 passages. And what do I mean by this? spend your 35 minutes doing those 3 passages. That's going to give you about 12-ish minutes per passage. Increase your accuracy on those. And then on the last passage, on the 4th passage, just guess. And by chance, you should get like 2 to 3 of those right, minimum. And so when you take that, you do the math, if you assume you do really well in those other 3 passages and you do decent on your guessing, that can get you to around a 25 to a 27. So that's your 3 to 4 points, maybe more. So that would be where I would start, given your situation. Just pick 3 passages, and the one you guess on should be the one that's hardest for you. So if, for me, fiction would be my hard passage. So if I were doing this, I would just guess on that 4th passage, passage 1 in this case, the fiction, and then the other 3 passages, I would do those, use all my time on those 3, increase my accuracy, and that can be the recipe to a 25 to a 27. So that'd be the quickest thing. Once you want to get into the high 20s, low 30s, then of course you can't do this. But given your situation, that would be a good place to start. Will there be more live streams? Yes, there will be a lot more live streams. So stay tuned. How to do written math problems. Again, a bit general because, I mean, there's dozens of different types of math problems. So maybe you meant word problems. I don't know. If you want to follow up, let me know. If you want to narrow the question, I can hopefully give you a good answer. Dual passages. How would the writer from passage 1... Okay. So we got a question on dual passages. And this would apply both to SAT and ACT, now that the ACT has a dual passage in it. So these questions are what I call detailed dual. Because we're taking the detail from one passage, an actual line reference, and then we want to know how the author of the other passage would respond to that. The most important thing to know to help answer these questions is the passage relationship. So you need to know passage 1, passage 2, passage A, passage B, depending on which test. What is the relationship between the 2 passages? And there's really 3 categories. And the most common one is that they're opposite. They disagree. So often on the SAT, you get a lot of history passages that are like about feminism or something. And you've got one person who has one position and then another person who has an opposite position. Right? So that passage relationship is going to be critical for understanding questions like this. Because the fact that one author disagrees with the other very often is going to color how they're going to respond to the other person's writing. Another relationship you might get would be similar. So they both are writing about the same issue, but they agree, more or less. And then if they agree, or they're, in the same ballpark, that's going to color how they're going to respond to each other's writing. And then the last one is no relationship. You don't see this too often. Used to see it a lot more, I think, on the old SAT, but not on the new one. This would be if they're talking about a topic which they're talking about the same topic, but they don't really agree or disagree. They're just kind of talking about it in a different way. So maybe one passage, for example, would be about the history of comic books, and then another passage would be about a particular author's experience with comic books in the 80s. Right? There's no necessarily link between those two. You're not really going to see that too often on either test. These are the most common, and especially opposite disagree. So you want to know, the main thing I would say here, after you've finished both passages, you want to go back and check, do I know what the relationship is between these passages? Because that's the key. Do they agree? Do they disagree? On what do they agree or disagree? Because that's going to help you with a lot of those questions. I'm assuming this is about the ACT. Should you skim passages, read some lines, or read the whole passages on ACT reading? I'm assuming it's ACT reading. Answer is read the whole passage, but quickly. So generally I recommend reading an ACT passage, or skimming it more so, in 2 to 3 minutes, and you're paying attention to 2 things. You're paying attention to the main idea, or if it's fiction, point of view, and like the plot, and then the structure of the passage, how it's organized. And then you go to questions immediately. Okay, let me get to some emailed questions here. Okay, again, another question that's a little hard for me to answer, and I'll tell you why. What's the best thing to do when there's 21 days left? Very similar to like the last minute question. What to do at the last minute? I don't really know what the best thing would be for you to do given what you've studied so far, what your score is right now, what your goals are. So I don't know. The main thing I would say probably, I mean, this probably applies to anyone, is take a real practice test in practice test conditions. So I really recommend treating this as seriously as you can. That means getting up early in the morning on a weekend and maybe going to a library or going to a quiet place, not in your house, with some pencils, with a stopwatch, with a test you haven't done before, a real test from the SAT or the ACT, with a bubble sheet, and make that practice test as realistic as you can. Because you want to get into that experience of doing it early in the morning. You're somewhat groggy, right? Teenage brain, it doesn't work well in the morning. So you want to do it then rather than 3 o'clock on a lazy Saturday. It's just a different experience. So doing it in the morning like it was a real thing. If you can get someone to proctor you, that would be probably the best thing in the world. But if not, you can proctor yourself and really getting that experience of doing a full test. And then once you've done that full test and you check your answers and you scored it, going over every single question, even ones you got right, to really make sure that you fully understand the test. That is the meat of a real good SAT and ACT program, is going through that process of doing tests, doing sections, doing homeworks, packets, whatever it is, and then reviewing those questions and seeing what you need help with. And then you can bring those questions to the live streams, or you can contact me and we can do tutoring or whatever. But those practice tests are the key. Really doing those full practice tests in real conditions, as simulated as you can, that's going to lead to the best results for you. Okay. So I got some specific question requests from the official SAT book. Just give me a second. Okay, so 348, number 52. So if you want to follow along, I'm in the official book. It's this one right here. And we're going to look at some specific questions here. So since this is somewhat awkward without the passage or the question, I guess what I'll do for these is I'll just give you a hint as to what to pay attention to answer this one. So 52, page 348 in the blue book. Which point about the resources that will be highly valued in space is implicit in passage 1 and explicit in passage 2? So this is a very tricky one because it's about what is implicit in 1. By implicit, they mean what is not stated directly, what is not stated explicitly, and then what's explicit in passage 2. So in other words, what is stated directly. So the way I would do this one, and I'll let you try this one on your own, since we want to know what's explicit in passage 2, what you need to find in those 4 choices, which of those 4 choices is stated in passage 2 explicitly. And from there, you should be able to eliminate maybe all of them, but maybe 2 choices. And then, depending on what you have left, then you got to go back to passage 1 and see, okay, given those, what I have left, which one of these is implied, right? Implicit would mean implied. Which of these is not stated explicitly, but is nonetheless stated if you conclude from whatever it is that they did say. So that's what I would say about that. Page 460 in the blue book, number 32. 460, number 32. Okay, this one's probably really difficult to do because it's a dual passage question, finding the line from one passage that would agree with the claim of another passage. I'm going to take a pass on this one just because what we're going to have to do to answer this, why I'm going to pass for this one now, is this will require us to read one passage, read the other passage, see what's going on in one passage, read all the references from those lines to match with that passage. It's going to take us like 10 minutes. And unfortunately, we just don't have the time for that. So when and if we have the time, if you want to contact me directly about this, maybe I can help. But just to keep this somewhat a viewable experience, I'm going to skip that one because that seems really complicated. Let's see. How to not get lost in the fiction part of ACT reading. I read, but I don't understand what I'm reading. Fiction's my weakness. The main thing with fiction is to avoid that, is to avoid exactly that, getting lost in what you're reading. This applies to SAT reading as well. And the main cure for this is, again, you're going to read 2 to 3 minutes. You're just reading to get a general sense of the plot and the structure. But then whenever you read after that, for the ACT at least, and the SAT, I guess, you should always be reading with a question in mind. You should never be reading just to read it, except in that one case of the ACT in the beginning to get the structure and the main idea. Even there, you're looking for something. So you should always be reading looking for the answer to a question, not to read it in a general sense because of this problem. Because if we're just reading it in a blah, general way, what are we supposed to be looking for? There's 1,000 things we could be paying attention to. So instead, always read looking for the answer to a question. That keeps you very focused. I made videos on this. If you check my Just Pick C series, I made a video on this very topic. What's it have to do with ACT reading? I don't recall. But if you check my playlist of Just Pick C videos, it'll be there about not zoning out when you're reading. I think that's what it was called. How not to zone out when reading. So I made a video on that. You can check that out. Okay, let's just check my emails here. Just make sure I'm done. Okay. Okay, let's get to this email. Okay, so an ACT question about scores. Again, a bit general, hard for me to give really great advice. So instead, I think I'm going to focus, against, I guess I'll focus more on this one because I think it's a bit more specific. Because getting from a 30 to a 34 to 36 depends on the section, right? Depends on whether you're talking about English, math, reading, science. So it's hard to give a really blanket answer that would be of any use. So let me talk more specifically about the science. Again, it's hard to know why you're getting a 30 instead of those, whether you're finishing the section in time or if you're running out of time or if you're finishing it but you're getting questions wrong. And then it depends on what question types you're getting wrong, which passage types. So it's a bit complicated. I guess I would say this. Most likely in the science section, you're getting certain question types wrong, and I can list them out. Most likely, a number of the ones you're getting wrong include the last question of each passage. The last question of each passage on ACT Science is actually typically harder than the rest. And often, if you actually see the ones students at this point get wrong, it's usually the last one of each passage. It's weird, but they're harder, so it makes sense. Other ones you might be getting wrong involve experimental design and reasoning. In other words, why did the scientists design the experiment the way they did? What can you conclude from the data? What hypotheses are supported or not supported? Right? Very different from the more straightforward graph questions where it's just reading data off of a graph. These are more about the scientific method. And I actually made a video, it's part of my science course, but you can find it on YouTube, about the scientific method. So watching that video and really understanding controls and variables and how all that works out, or at least refreshing it if you already know, can help. And then the final thing would be outside knowledge. So there is some very minuscule outside knowledge tested on ACT Science. You want to make sure you know all of that. And the best way to learn that is to get a resource that shows you where all the outside knowledge is. So there's probably websites out there you can find. Just Google ACT Science outside knowledge. I'm sure you'll find a ton of stuff. Then also in my ACT Science course, I have like a packet of the facts and factoids and figures and things based on outside knowledge that you should know. So that would be another resource if that was something you were interested in. So those would be the main three things I would say for now. Again, it's hard to know without getting into more details about your situation. Okay, so let's put this here. Okay, so I'll get back to some chat questions. Okay, I take the SAT on June 3rd. I'm already at a consistent 1300. What should be my next steps to get as high as possible? Note, I do have your course bought on Reason Prep. Cool, thank you. In terms of your 1300, what to do next, again, it depends on the section, whether you're looking at reading, writing, or math. First thing would be whichever course you have, make sure you've completed it, or if you have completed it, rewatch it. That will certainly help. If you want to follow up in chat and just let me know which section in particular, like what the breakdown might be as well, like if you're talking about reading, writing, and then math, what the scores might be, because then I can give more specific advice, but it's hard to know what a 1300 can mean. It can be a 700 in one, a 600 in the other, or 650, 650, and then you could be weaker in reading than in writing. So if you can be more specific, I might be able to give a better answer than that. Question about relative clauses and relative adverbs. Do we never have to put commas before when or other relative adverbs? Typically not, no. You're not going to see these very often on the SAT, I have to admit. If this is about SAT, same thing with the ACT, I guess, so it doesn't really matter. What the question's about is when you have sentences like this. Let's see this. It was the year when I visited France. So here, essentially, we've got this word when, which is standing in for the... almost cut myself from the stand. The word when is basically standing in for the word year. And so here, we would pretty much never want to have a comma. That would not be a proper usage. Other examples of this would be where. So that was the place where I found the treasure chest. There, you wouldn't use a comma. So typically not. I don't really think they would test it very often. Although this is not really a relative adverb, actually. I have to rewrite the sentence. It was the year... Oh, wait a minute. I'll have to think of a better example of this because that's not a good example. But in any event, no. To answer the question, no. You're not going to have a when, a comma in between those, typically. How do I answer function questions in the reading section? Function questions, it's pretty rare. They used to be much more common than on the SAT, at least. In the future, if y'all could specify whether it's SAT or ACT reading, it'll help. I just have to guess. I assume this is SAT reading, though it's probably the same in ACT reading anyway. So function questions. The key thing there is to realize that the answers are verbs. The first word of each choice is usually a verb. So it'll be like examine, blah, analyze, blah, depict, blah, show, blah, explain, blah. So the focus should be on those verbs in the choices. And then what you got to think is that part of the passage doing that action? Is it explaining? Is it showing? Is it highlighting? And you really want to pay attention to that. A big example of where students can get in trouble so here are like 3 choices. Okay, so let's say these are the 4 choices to a given function question. Without even looking at the question or the passage, almost always these will be wrong, especially if it's a very focused question about like 2 lines. The reason why is to analyze something, it's going to take more than 2 lines. It'll often take more than a paragraph. So I don't want to say it's always wrong, but words like analyzes, describes, things like that, they're too broad. They're too, not broad, but they're just too detailed for what you could possibly do in those sentences. Whereas something like mentions or contradicts or emphasizes, those are typically more what can be done in a few lines. So really pay attention to those verbs. That, because the focus on function questions is what the passage is doing at that moment. Should you glance at the questions first in ACT reading? No, I don't think so. Read through the passage 2 to 3 minutes, looking for main idea and structure, then go to your questions, and then I have a lot more to say about question order. I talk about this in my reading course. Long story short, you do specific to general questions. Do not do them in order. If you're doing ACT reading questions in order, 1 through 10, 11 through 20, you're probably making mistakes in the sense that you're not being as efficient as you can be. You want to start from most specific and then work your way out to the more general questions. Okay, so follow up, 700 in math and 600 in English. I assume the 600 in English was probably all reading, I'm guessing, was the main thing that took you down. If not, I would focus on the writing at first because there's a lot of easy points that you can get that you're probably missing in the writing because the writing is the easiest of the 3 sections. Then it comes down to reading. So then what you want, I think you had to follow up. Okay, we'll get that in a second. So the reading, yeah, you're going to want to... with the reading, you're going to want to focus a lot on that. Again, it's hard to say without knowing what the mistakes are, but there are probably some easier points that you can get there, probably based on paying more attention to specific clues in the text. With math, it's probably the hardest question types that give you trouble. So things like, if you have my math course, I think you mentioned you had something. I don't know if it was the math or all the courses, but it would be things like trigonometry, functions, polynomials, probabilities, percents. Like there's a certain set of question types, data, surveys, scatter plots, different question types like that. Systems of equations, especially finding different types of solutions. There's certain questions that typically are harder than average, so I would focus on those. So check out the math course, which I think you said you had access to. That should cover a lot of that. Also, this goes for anybody. You can send me your score report. So if you go to my website, I'm going to try to see if I can switch over to this. Sorry for the blank screen. It'll not be blank in a second. Sorry, it's coming. Okay, all right, here we go. Okay, sorry about that. So if you go to my website, if you go to reasonprep.com, if you look under strategy and you go to score report analysis, if you send me a score report from your recent test, I can take a closer look and give you more specific advice. It's hard to give really specific advice on the stream, partly because I don't know enough about you, and frankly, it won't be super useful to everybody. So if you want to send me your score report, you can do so here, and I'd be happy to take a look at it and give you some specific advice. Okay, so let me go back here. All right, I'm getting my tech. I'm figuring it out. Okay, so question next. Is it possible to jump to a 1600 in this time frame? I forget, when did you said you were taking it next? June. Starting from a 1300, pretty hard because that's 300 points, which is hard in general, especially in 2 months, less than 2 months. Not impossible. I would just focus on getting to the next level. So you're at 1300. The next step is 1400. Once you can get that in your practice, then worry about getting 1450. And then once you can get that in your practice, get to 1500. So don't think about going from 13 to 16 in one jump. That's a big jump. But instead 13 to 14, 14 to 14.5, 14.5 to 15, and bootstrap your way up there. Probably more realistic if you're really going for 1600 by the August sitting, because there's going to be an August SAT now, or the fall. So an October sitting is probably the most realistic. But hey, you never know. I don't want to say it's impossible, but it is very rare. I would say that. Should you take the same ACT test over and over again until you can get into 36 and understand how to get each answer, or does this only work for math and English? Yeah, so I wouldn't retake the tests, but what I would do is you take the test or the section, check your answers, and then review every question untimed, just like figuring out whether it's math, reading, writing, science, English. If I got this question wrong, why did I get it wrong? If I got it right, Did I get it right for the right reasons? Is there a faster way to do it? Really take your time and review and analyze each question. Maybe later down the line you could retake it or at least review it, but I wouldn't worry about reviewing it constantly. Just do the test, review the questions, and then move on. And then maybe later, return to some of the ones, see if you can redo them later, like a month or two later or whatever, and see if you still get them. And if you don't, review them again. So I wouldn't say making reviewing tests, like redoing tests, a core part of your practice, but occasionally you could throw it in there. All right, so I'm going to email. Okay, we've got a question about trig. This is from a test. So I'm going to just draw it out here, and I apologize for my terrible pictures. Okay. In the unit circle with center O. So, by the way, when they say unit circle, they mean it's got a radius of 1. So I know that's got a radius of 1. The length of arc PQ, which I assume is this, PQ, is pi over 3. What is the value of the cosine of POQ? Cosine of theta. So, we got a trig here. We've got some arc stuff. All right, all good stuff. So the first thing we need to realize is in a unit circle, the measure of the arc is going to be the same as the measure of the angle. So in this case, it's just pi over 3 would be the radian measure of the angle in a unit circle. So now I need to know my trigonometry. Don't know if this would be in a calculator section or not. If it's calculator, it's easy. You just plug in cosine of pi over 3 into your calculator. But here's an example of what I was talking about before in terms of shortcuts, things to know. You should be able to know cosine of pi over 3 is a half. Or alternatively, that this can be translated into cosine of 60 and that's a half. You should know that instantly. And so one of the ways that you can learn all this is you can learn how to copy this diagram. So when I was in school, when I was in high school, which by the way was a really long time ago, I may not look it, but I'm actually really old. I went to school, I graduated in 2002 from high school. It was 15 years ago. But anyway, when I was in school, when I was in calculus or pre-calculus, what I would do to learn this is I would every day before math, I would copy down from memory this diagram that I'm going to show you. And then over time, I learned it so that to this day, I know all of these trig functions. And for SAT, where in some part of the test you don't have a calculator, this is really useful to be able to know. So it's the sine, cosine, and tangent of 30, 45, and 60. So we can fill this in. We got a half, radical 2 over 2, radical 3 over 2, 1 half, radical 2 over 2, radical 3 over 2, radical 3 over 3, 1, and radical 3. So that is, boom, right there. Sometimes in school you're told to learn the unit circle. I'm not a big fan of that. I think it's too much memorization. There's some nice patterns and things to remember in this that can really help you. So I like this rather than unit circle, but that's a conversation for another time because that's kind of complicated. Okay. Is it okay to start from back to front on SAT math section? Very good question. Thank you for asking it. And it's okay that you're late. There's no, you're not going to get in trouble from the teacher. And by the way, any of you can just pop in and out. This is totally informal. Don't feel like any of you have to stay. Anyway, the question was, is it okay to start from back to front? So the answer is no. And I'm going to have a very specific reason why it's not okay to do that. So let's say we're talking about section 4. And I'm just going to do something very rough. Okay. So I've grouped these questions in order, in chunks, by approximate difficulty. So again, this is very approximate. Don't be wedded to this. But 1 to 12, there's an order of difficulty in math. So the first 12-ish questions we might consider to be like an easy. And then the middle set we might consider to be like medium. And on the score reports for the PSAT, this is like 1 bar, 2 bars, or 3 bars of difficulty, basically. For these, we would call these hard. And then when you get to the grid-ins, which is the next set, the difficulty resets. So this would be easy. This would be medium. And And again, this is approximate. This is not exact. Every test is different, but it's just for illustration purposes, and this would be hard. So the question was, is it okay to do it from back to front, to start from these and work your way backwards? And the thinking here, I'm guessing, and a lot of times this is what people think, is since these questions are so hard and they take more time, I need to get those done first before I worry about the easier ones, because I need the time to do those hard ones. And that actually has it backwards, because if you spend way too much time on the hard questions and maybe even still get them wrong, and then you have to rush or skip or guess easy questions, that's like the worst thing you can do. Because now you're spending way too much time on hards. You're making avoidable mistakes on easy questions. Not good. So instead, do it the traditional way. And again, depending on your scoring range, you might actually consider skipping these hard chunks, getting all the easy and medium stuff done first, and then going back to the hards. Again, it depends on your scoring range, your goals, things like that. But you absolutely want to start. And this is a general rule of thumb for the SAT and the ACT, no matter the section. And that is, you do easy stuff first and then you do hard stuff last. Because if I'm going to have to guess or skip questions, I would rather guess on hard questions than on easy ones. Obviously, right? Why would I want to guess on a question that I could do if I just had 15 seconds or 20 seconds? It's a disaster to do that, right? Rather than, okay, there's a really hard question. If I do it, maybe it'll take me 4 minutes to solve it, and maybe I'll still get it wrong. Well, in that case, why don't you just do everything, all the easy stuff first, and then guess on the hard one? So definitely prioritize easy stuff first, bank all those easy points, bank all those medium points, and then worry about the hard ones. So I do recommend doing it in the traditional path. Can you go over absolute value inequalities and word problems? So I don't have a specific example, Vishvac 2000, but so if you wanted to post a specific example, we could go through it. But I will give you one tip, which may help with these kinds of questions. So the questions we're referring to here, I don't know, let's say it's a 27 or something, and blah, 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 word problem. And then your choices will look maybe something like this. So you'll have like, I don't know. Ah, dang. I just did it again. Damn thing. All right. So maybe your choices will look like, I don't know. And then, I don't know. Okay, let's say your choices are like that. The main tip I would give you for these is don't worry about trying to do this algebraically. Typically, plugging in and testing numbers as your x values and seeing which of these either works or doesn't work, depending on what you're looking for, is the way to go. So find an x value that would satisfy the inequality, plug them in, and see which ones actually work, right? Instead of trying to solve for it directly. So if you want to give a specific example, we can go through that, but that would be the main thing with these. Don't try to work this out algebraically. It's often too complicated. Just plug in your own values, test them out, see how it works. How did you do on your ACT, SAT, and when did you take it? So as I was just alluding to, I'm really old, and I took the SAT way back in 2001. And this was not only, obviously not the new version of the test, it wasn't even the version of the test that you would have taken just a couple of years ago. So I took the one that was in place before they changed it in 2005, which is before, of course, they just changed it recently. So I was the old version of the test. And in that version of the test, it was also out of 1600. So I went from 1600 then, and then in 2005, it went to 2400, and now it's back to 1600. So then the SAT world was very different. It wasn't as crazy as it is now, we'll put it that way. So I took the test once because I got what I wanted to get. I think I got a 1410, which was good enough for me then. It was like math was 710 and verbal was 700, something like that. And that's all I needed, so I was done. I never studied for it, and in prep, I didn't even know there were prep classes. It was a very different world back in 2001. So I got my 1410. I was happy. I was good. Nowadays, when I take practice tests and tests like that, yeah, usually, unless I'm really lazy, which sometimes happens, I'll get, maybe one wrong occasionally, but most of the time I get them all right. For the ACT, I never took an ACT in high school because back then for various reasons. Not everyone took both tests. We just took the SAT. So I'd never taken an official ACT when I was a student. Probably would have gotten, I would guess, again, without studying, probably something in the low 30s would be my guess. Maybe high 20s is probably too low. Like low 30s, probably what I would have gotten. That's just a guess. Nowadays, though, yeah, I can get them most of the time, unless I'm lazy or I just make a stupid error. I'll usually get them all right. Could I get at least a 1300 in May? So, I skipped the question. Wait, did I? No, I didn't. Okay, cool. I've been preparing for my May SAT test since January. I've used several books in Khan Academy. I took a practice test in the beginning of March, and it was 1160. And then could I get at least a 1300 in May? It's only a few weeks away, so it's kind of I don't know what you've gotten. So at the beginning of March, you got 1160. Depends on where you're at now. I would say take a practice test, see where you're at now. Going from 1160 to a 1300, that's reasonable. So I think it's possible. It just depends on kind of where you're at right now. But it is possible. I would think it's something you could do. Jimmy, can you go over the harder questions? Well, if you've got specific ones, I can definitely go through them. But I can't really pick out specific ones without knowing specific ones. So if you want to send me some or post some, I'd be happy to go through them. How similar to the SAT essay is the AP Language and Composition Rhetorical Analysis essay? I believe very similar. I'm not a super expert in the AP Language and Comp Rhetorical Analysis essay, but they're similar. Certainly, the rigor of the AP test is going to be much more than the rigor of the SAT writing or the SAT essay. But if you're doing AP Language and Comp, and if you're doing the rhetorical analysis practice, you should be well prepared for the SAT essay. It's a simpler version of that, basically. It's the same idea, right? You're trying to understand and explore and analyze how the author is trying to persuade his or her readers by using certain rhetorical devices and strategies and all that kind of stuff. So it's the same idea, but just like on the AP Lang and Comp, again, I'm not an expert, but I think you're supposed to be more responsible for some of the precise, fancy jargon in terms of different kinds of strategies. Whereas on the SAT, that's nice to know, and I do recommend knowing it, but it's not required. You could write an essay without using fancy jargon and get a perfect score. So if you're good on AP Language and Comp, SAT essay should be straightforward. By the way, just so everyone knows, I'm going at 6:11 now, my time. I'm going to be ending the stream probably 6:20, something like that. But again, we will have more of these sessions. So stay tuned to Reason to Prep. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Join my website. I send out email announcements when I'm going to do this. Join my Facebook group. So all this stuff will be posted in the description of the video when this is eventually posted on the site. And just check out my website and you'll find plenty of ways to know when the next stream is going to be. What do you suggest would be the best way to study? Best way to study, do practice sections timed, do practice tests timed, and then review your work. I mean, that's really the core of any study program, whether you're doing a tutor, whether you're doing classes, whether you're doing self-prep, whether you're doing video courses, whether you're working out of a book. No matter how you're learning for the SAT or ACT, practice sections, practice tests timed, and then review every single question. Be thorough so that you know, what am I weak at? What am I strong at? What do I need to review? And then you can bring questions to things like this, to if you have a tutor or whatever, if you're working with me, whatever it might be, bring those questions to your teacher and you can work on those more. Can you go over the ACT writing and how it is scored? So I'll do this briefly. So the ACT writing test is basically the essay. And there are 4 scores you get. Let me just type these out. So on the ACT English or the ACT writing test, there are 4 categories you are graded on. You're graded on ideas and analysis, which is basically your thesis and how well you analyze whatever it is you're reading. Development support is how well you elaborate and provide examples and evidence for whatever you're saying. Organization, probably self-explanatory. It's how the essay is organized. And then language use is the quality of the writing, sentence structure, vocabulary, grammar, spelling, things like that. They're all graded. So you have a grader that will grade you from 1 to 6 in each category. And then since you've got 2 graders, the final report will be from 2 to 12 in each of these categories. And then whatever that is averaged to give a final overall score of 2 to 12. So on your report, it'll say like 9. And that is a average of the scores of the other 4 sections. This score is not, just like on the SAT essay, not incorporated at all into your composite. So that composite 1 to 36 for your multiple choice is totally separate from the essay. They've got some things where they've got like other scores that combine it, but no one pays attention to that. Just the composite score and the essay, they're basically treated separately. So yeah, that's how it's graded. Would preparing AP language comp multiple choice questions help me in SAT reading? Sort of. They're going to be a lot harder than SAT reading. So if you can do those, you should be good at SAT reading. I would do those only if you've done, only if you're out of like real SAT tests. Then maybe you can go to that for backup. But I would, for most part, stick with real SAT tests when you can. And actually, I have a video on this on YouTube where I talk about what to do when you run out of tests for the SAT. So check that. Check out my YouTube page for that. Lucky Luke, I watched all the videos on Reason Prep. From there, just take as many practice tests as possible, correct? Pretty much, right? The one thing I would say with any kind of prep process, don't overthink it. They're not, like, there's no, a lot of, I try not to do this, and I hope I don't, but, like, there's no magic bullet. There's not something that you're all missing that only if you knew you'd suddenly get a 36 or 1600. It's not really like that. Some companies and tutors and stuff might make it seem that way, but it's just not true. There's no magic bullet. Certainly there's resources that can help, and there's courses and there's videos and there's books, and they can all help. But in the end, it just comes down to do practice sections and tests, review your answers, figure out what you're weak in, review those concepts, learn strategies to get better at that. That's it. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but that's it. There's no real, like, it's not like if I'm not holding anything back from you where it's like, if you pay me money, I will tell you the one thing you need to know that will get you a 36 or 1600. No such thing exists. There are strategies and things that help, but in the end, it's, just doing the grunt work of practice tests, practice sections, timed, review, read, review some more. No real secret sauce. I can never finish the reading passage. Help. How do I read faster? So I talked about this a little bit earlier in the live stream. So when the video is up, check that out later. I will say, in terms of the reading faster aspect, I wouldn't think of it as reading faster. It's not really about reading faster. It's about reading more efficiently, which is different. So it's about reading what you need to read at the level you need to read it. So are we talking ACT or, let's see. Okay, don't know if this is ACT or SAT, but I guess it applies either way. When you're looking at an SAT reading or ACT reading passage, not every part of that passage are they going to ask questions about. So fully understanding the parts of the passage that they ask nothing about, it's a waste of time, most cases. What we want to worry about are the parts of the passage that they do ask questions about. So it's not about reading everything faster. It's about finding what's important and what's not. And that's a different way to think about it. Again, I go into this a lot more detail elsewhere, but yeah. Okay, so you said it's ACT. It applies for ACT. Like, most of the stuff you read, they're not going to ask questions about. So reading that faster, not really going to matter. What's going to matter is knowing what's important and what's not. And you get that from seeing what questions they ask. So if they ask you questions about lines 10 to 12, that's something to pay more attention to. If they ask you questions about the 7th paragraph, that's something to pay more attention to. So it's about where you spend your attention rather than like a brute force reading approach. What exam do you prefer for non-native speaker, SAT, ACT? Probably SAT, because there's just less to read, pretty much. There's no science section, basically, and the English section / writing is shorter. And there's more math comparatively, well, sort of, relatively. So probably SAT, but in the end, I would just say take a test of each and see what you think. I've got a page on my site that shows you how to compare your scores for SAT, ACT. So take an SAT test, take a practice ACT test, and then compare your scores, and then also just see how you feel. You might prefer one or the other. My guess, though, is you'll probably like SAT better. Do colleges care more about the ACT or SAT? So neither. They like both equally. There's no difference. Used to be they preferred the SAT more than the ACT, but not like that anymore. Either one, perfectly fine. So pick the one that works for you. So I'm going to wrap up, just answer a few more questions. Thank you for answering my questions. You are very welcome. Thanks for the advice. I'm looking forward to more live streams. Have a nice day. You have a nice day too. There will be more live streams, so definitely pay attention. Final question. I can't focus on reading a passage. It's too boring, and plus English is my second language. So like I was mentioning earlier, so check this out earlier in the stream when I post it. I've got a video on how not to zone out when reading ACT reading passages. So that video, if you go to my YouTube channel page, it's part of, let me see if I can just get, rather than telling you what it is, just find it. No. I don't know. I have to find it later. Anyway, wait, was that it? Oh, here it is. Excuse me. Here, I'll put it in chat. So that video covers how not to zone out when reading. So I would definitely check that out. Okay, so we're going to wrap up for today. Like I said, we're going to have future live streams. So definitely, if you're interested, pay attention to my YouTube channel. Join Reason Prep. You'll get updates about when we're going to have them. Join my Facebook group if you haven't. We do a lot of questions and we review a lot of stuff in the Facebook group. Let me just post a link to that as well. Hey, why did it blank it out? What the? Okay. Did it do it? Okay, yeah. So that's the link to the Facebook group if you haven't joined already. Feel free to check out my website, join my courses. There's a number of free courses for both the SAT and the ACT you should definitely check out. And I've got courses for the entire tests, both SAT and ACT, that are also available on the site. Part of those are free, others are not. So check that out if you want to learn more. I also offer tutoring if you want to do one-on-one tutoring, anything from a class here and there to something more intensive. But yeah, let me know if you have any other questions or comments. Feel free to keep sending questions that we'll talk about in the next live stream. And I look forward to seeing you all then. The video for this will probably be out by later today. It just depends on how long it takes me to edit it, which unfortunately might be somewhat long. So it was good to talk to you all, and look forward to the next live stream. See ya.